Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Ad Age Remotely. I'm Janine Poggi, Senior Editor here at Ad Age, and today I'm joined live by BET Network's President, Scott Mills. Hi, Scott.
How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before we get started, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on our social channels, and we will try to get to them during our conversation. So in the wake of George Floyd's death at the hands of police officer, the media, marketing, and ad world is taking a closer look at how it can help affect change and push for social justice. But of course, this hasn't been an industry that has historically been a picture of diversity. Scott, what is the responsibility of media brands to really take a stand and use their voice during these times?
I think first and foremost, for any brand, the question is, what do you represent? And who do you serve? And then how do these issues relate to the people you serve and to what your brand stands for? So, for example, for BET, it's incredibly easy, but I'm not sure if you all saw the Reebok social posting where they wrote, without Black culture, without Black people, Reebok wouldn't exist. But the other thing that I thought that was much more powerful, they said, we're not trying to get you to buy shoes. We're trying to get you to walk in someone else's shoes, right? And it was so powerful and it was so on point. And we're having conversations with so many of our marketing partners who are stating that it's so important for them to engage on this issue, that they believe that as corporations, they have a responsibility to engage on these issues. Right. So I think the fact that so many companies and so many brands in this moment are saying we can no longer sit on the sidelines on this issue. We need to step up and we need to be part of the solution and we need to be supportive, I think is an extraordinary thing. And I love the fact that media is there.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit first about what BET has been doing and is out there talking about. As part of Viacom CBS, you, along with your sibling networks, went dark yesterday for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which of course is the amount of time, Floyd was pinned down. Can you speak about that and sort of the reactions and impact you've seen so far?
Right. The reactions have been really extraordinary. It was a clear sign to our viewers, to our advertisers, to our partners that we were absolutely serious and committed to this cause and to really being supportive of what's going on at the not just at the moment, but as it lives and has lived in this country for such a long period of time. At BET, we've gone multiple steps farther, including this evening. We're having a BET News special called Justice Now. And with that special, we're bringing in leaders from the activist community, politicians, and entertainers to specifically speak to the issues that are relevant to African Americans that are happening right now. The protests, the calls for change, the calls for justice, and the path forward, and even the discussions around how people handle the feelings, what's happening with the unrest. And so we have everybody from Cory Booker to the president of the NAACP, to John Legend, to T.I., all coming together to speak to the African American community and share their perspective. And then later this week, we'll do a town hall where we'll give the opportunity for our audience to share their hopes, dreams, concerns, fears, angers,
right,
and share it with the country at large, and then specifically engage a panel of subject matter experts who can help there. And then the final piece that we've done is we announced today that we are holding for the first time a BET presidential forum. And we've extended a formal invitation to President Donald Trump, as well as to presumptive Democratic nominee Joseph Biden, to participate in the BET forum, to speak specifically to our audience in the African American community about what they, as president, are prepared to commit to do to address the issues plaguing the African American community.
And when is that slated for?
We're actually scheduled that for June 19th, which is Juneteenth, which we think is an auspicious date for that.
Yeah.
The macro concept being that the freedoms that were promised and afforded have not yet been delivered. And so it's a timely date to have the conversation around who's really prepared to commit to address these issues for the African American community.
Right. One thing I noticed on social media today was that sibling network Nickelodeon is actually trending for the I Can't Breathe spot, the same one that, was shown across networks, with critics saying that it's scaring their children. What do you say to this? And, is there a different tone for children and for, different communities that you think needs to be addressed?
I think that's an individual decision. For example, in my household, I have 8-year-old boy-girl twins, and my 8-year-old boy-girl twins have not seen the video. We certainly would not share that tragic and heartbreaking video. We think it would just be too difficult for them to process at this age. And so I do think that Nickelodeon made a conscious decision to air that, and felt that it was important for the people who were viewing the network at that time to see that, and certainly the risk was that some people would have found it very disturbing. I think that certainly wasn't the point, and the objective there, and I know the objective was to really ensure that everybody kind of focused on the issues at hand.
Right. So, back to some of the conversation around brands, and you mentioned Reebok as being authentic in sort of its conversation on Twitter and talking about the issues. There are definitely some brands that I am hearing from that are, choosing to pull, their social media content right now during this time, because they are grappling with what is the right thing to say and how do they say it authentically as a brand. What is sort of the advice that you're sort of giving brand partners at this point of how they can, be a part of and help bring about change?
I think that people are looking for authentic responses from brands. And what that doesn't mean is they don't want a brand that is important to a community, but has historically been important, but, for example, doesn't speak in a particular lexicon or isn't particularly urban. They don't want those brands to suddenly try to pivot and communicate in a voice that's not authentic to the brand. Right. What they clearly want, what the community clearly wants, and the opportunity for brands, and I think the brands that we're seeing that are doing it the strongest, is to see solidarity around this issue. And I think I've seen a lot of our partners have gotten very comfortable with one, concluding that they should show solidarity, and two, determining how in a voice that's authentic to their brand to do that. And what I'm seeing is actually some of our partners are going kind of well beyond simply a statement of solidarity.
That's what I was going to ask. I wanted to ask about that, because I'm wondering at this point in time, at this moment, is it enough just to tweet, moments, support, statements of support? Does there need to be more? Does there need to be action to back it up?
Yeah, there definitely needs to be more. I think one of the things that a lot of people accept is that government's not going to solve this on its own, right? And there's a perspective that corporations have a role to play in this solution. And you see it at Procter & Gamble, where they're really leading around discussions around race with programs like The Talk and what have you. And I think people are going to look to see how will corporations do more than simply express solidarity. How will they play a role? What are the roles? Now, having said that, what people acknowledge is these issues are extraordinarily complicated. But where brands have a role is to really think about where else in society have we tackled long-standing and pervasive issues and changed the arc of those issues, right? So an example I like to use is domestic violence. If you think back 40 years ago, domestic violence was this thing that society didn't acknowledge. It was kind of hidden in the closet. There were no consequences to it, and it was a real scourge. And through a combination of changes in laws and changes in stated values, empowering, the victims, vilifying the perpetrators, a series of concerted efforts, that there's been a material impact on the incidence, the lethality of domestic violence. And there are other examples like that. And so the question is, what are the roles of brands to help the company drive this change? And that's what we at BET are focused on, which is how can we partner with brands who are interested in driving this change, and how can we convene interested companies and say, what's everybody's role, what's everybody's contribution to driving this change?
Right. Is it about donating money? Is it there other actions that should be taken right now? What are the things that you think are most helpful in terms of your conversations with brands too, about how you can work together to do that?
Right. So I think the answer is it all depends on the brand, but money's going to be relevant. One of the reasons why money is going to be relevant is the core of the issue here is fundamentally racism, right? And we're not going to solve racism in 5 or 10 years, right? So really, if you think about the corporate model, corporations for years were trying to drive diversity by having hiring goals and having recruiting goals and having promotion goals. And what they learned was it wasn't working, right? They were bringing people in, but they were churning them out. And they identified that the problem was to really drive meaningful and persistent diversity, you actually had to have an inclusive environment. So they said, okay, what are the obstacles? Long story short, they got to this concept of unconscious bias. The idea that unconscious bias was a fundamental impediment to their goals for diversity and inclusion. And the thing was, once corporations figured that out, they then said, okay, we can't eliminate unconscious bias, right? Because it's actually a part of human nature. But given that we understand it and we understand how it impacts our processes adversely, we can create countermeasures to address where unconscious bias is having adverse impacts on our organization. So we have a perspective that same approach can be taken to what we're calling lethal racism, right? Which is to say that racism exists in this world. Where it creates lethality in particular is when law enforcement interacts specifically, typically with African-American men, right? If we understand that the fundamental driver of the lethality of those interactions are all of the kind of the legacy baggage associated with racism, the question is, what are the suite of countermeasures that we can create and implement to kind of to avoid the impact that we all would anticipate that racism would have in that, right? So all that is to say, we need scholarship to identify those things. We need money to actually pilot programs. We need research to assess the relative efficacy, and then we need to roll them out across the country. So we need money, we need advocacy, we need cities where brands have extraordinary relationships, because at the end of the day, these are all local issues, right? Each police force is a local team. Right. So brands can play roles in a number of ways.
Gotcha. So I'm Janine Poggi, and I'm here with Scott Mills, president of BET Networks. You were mentioning diversity and inclusion and hiring practices and things like that, which of course is a very large part of the issue. How should companies, brands, media companies be thinking about their hiring practices right now? And, what can change in a shorter amount of time? Because like you said, we're not going to change things fully 5 to 10 years from now, but there are steps right now that we can be taking.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things is to really focus on whether or not companies are equitably treating all of the communities that are in their employment pool, as well as in their consumer pool. And so this is a moment for everybody to understand that these inequities, if you really do believe that they fundamentally come back to the concept of racial disparities, every company should be thinking about, well, how's that influencing the environment that they have? How's that influencing their recruiting? How's that influencing their promotions? And also understand that I think the biggest driver in the evolution of lethal racism, the biggest driver, candidly, in the elimination of lethal racism, is going to be a function of corporations aligning with governments and civil rights organizations to drive this. And the appetite for corporations to do that, I think, is going to be a function of the diversity in those organizations, that there are people who are going to say, this is important, this is valuable, this is reflective of what's important to us. So I think there's an extraordinary moment for corporations to say, as we're as we're demanding change in the way the police force interacts with the African American community, let's ensure that we are being fair and equitable with how we're treating all of our employees across our organization.
Gotcha. We talked about some of the things that, brands can be or maybe should be doing. Are there things that at this point they should not do?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to avoid the risk of being inauthentic. I think that's a real risk. I think that every brand has a voice, every brand has a positioning, every brand has established lanes. And I think the key is to ensure that brands are showing up consistent with those through this time period. And I know it must be extraordinarily challenging when we think of the suite of brands, right? We're seeing civil unrest, we're seeing looting, brands are seeing their stores, being damaged in this world. And so really thinking about how do you respond to that and how do you show up that, and how do you process that? Being careful, being mindful about not making statements that run the risk of one, kind of using too broad a brush to paint the actions of a small group, and two, being mindful that brands don't do something that aligns them unintentionally with parties that they hope not to be aligned with.
Is it better then for a brand to stay silent until they get it right or think they have the right message, or is it important to react soon and quickly to make sure they're part of this conversation?
Well, I think reacting, much later than right now is not soon, right? So I think we've seen just a huge array of companies and brands get out there. And so I think anybody who's reacting, I'm just going to call it next week, is really been extraordinarily deliberate. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being deliberate. But I would just note that. Having said that, we have found that people really value the brands they care about taking a position on this, because it's so core to people's values. It's so core to people's expectations, right? It's very much coming down to, are you with us or are you not? And so I would say for any brand for whom the people who are at the core of this crisis are a meaningful part of their consumer base, it's very, very important for you to acknowledge what's going on, and very important for you to express solidarity. And I think there's a continuum, right? I think, there really is a continuum that's available to brands, and recognizing that continuum. I think brands that are more conservative than others can live at the more conservative end of that continuum, but I do think it's important to show up.
One of the big points of backlash that I've been seeing lately is brands being called out if they, are tweeting, shows of support, but actually their hiring practices, the people they're staffing, isn't matching what they're saying. And I think that to me right now is one of the things that are standing out as a place where brands can potentially go wrong.
I think that's right. And that's why I think at a macro level, what brands should do is say, if they are moved by this moment, they have to think about, this moment is not about the death of Mr. Floyd. That's really important, right? This moment is not. This moment is triggered by the death of Mr. Floyd, but it really is much more broadly about the pervasive effects of racism. And with respect to police interactions, that manifests with lethality. But we all know that one of the things driving this is that the COVID-19 disproportionately impacted communities of color here in the States, right? So coming out of that disproportionate impact then into the murder in Georgia, it's just profoundly overwhelming. And what people are ultimately looking at this moment is, it's about the profound and persistent inequalities that people seem to be so comfortable with.
Yeah. I did
And
actually, I wanted to get to that. You mentioned, COVID-19, and of course that plays a critical role in all of this that wasn't, around at the, times of many other social injustices that we've seen. How is that amplifying what we've seen, and how is that perhaps making responses different at this point than, unfortunately, the other incidents we've seen in years prior?
right, I definitely think it's amplifying. I think people were already disproportionately stressed, disproportionately anxious, much higher levels of unemployment, and unemployment was much greater in the, there's reports that unemployment around people of color was higher than the unemployment rates among other people. So you had all of those pre-existing stressors hitting the community. And then you had this cadence of 3 extraordinary killings. And candidly, the most, the piece de resistance was that not only did you have this cadence of these extraordinary killings, but leadership nationally and locally took a really passive position on these killings. And the intersection of COVID, these killings, and then the way leadership responded really kind of drove this to the breaking point. And I think it's important to understand that and understand what's happening in that context. Having said that, I also think that part of the reason corporations have responded the way they have, part of the reason we're seeing people marching globally in support of what's happening here in the United States, right? We're seeing it in Berlin, we're seeing it in London. Part of the reason we're seeing that is because one of the effects of COVID is that it's caused people to be more reflective about, I think, the human condition, and more reflective around right and wrong, and more reflective about equality and disparity. And I think that part of COVID is in some ways driving this broad support of this call for change that we might not otherwise have seen.
Gotcha. We have a question from Lewis on LinkedIn. You've shared great perspectives on how brands can step up. How can agencies and creatives do better?
I think one of the things is agencies and creatives play a key role in designing the messages. And what we know is that part of the way this has to change is we have to change the narratives, right? We have to change the beliefs. And we've seen creative do that in such important ways, right? We've seen creative do that. And I think what agencies and creatives can do is they can help their clients identify the messaging and creative that will help support communicating their commitment to this change and help influencing the change in values that we see. We've seen, probably not, I won't shout out particular brands, but we've seen brands deliver extraordinary creative that really speaks to their commitment to change, that resonates, and that's loud, and that's impactful. And I think the moment for that is really going to live on for a time here.
Do you expect to, see more brands come to, BET and the networks to help make this creative? Are you guys out there sort of helping them, shape it if they don't know how or don't know where to start? Like, what role do you think BET is going to play in this?
Yeah, we're having a lot of conversations, and it's less candidly about building the creative. I think we're seeing brands really valuing the partners that they have. The role that we're getting a lot of outreach around is having BET assess the creative construct and the messaging, right? Having BET, given who we are and our position with our community, help brands think through what are appropriate messages, what are appropriate images. And so it's less about us building it and much more about us partnering on that. And we've had a huge kind of series of outreaches from brands as well as from agencies. I had a lovely conversation earlier today from an agency that said, we really want to work with you all as we have our, not just for our clients, but for our entire agency, think about how we play a role in supporting this necessary change. So, and then we've had a bunch of our big clients just say, what is the right thing to do? How do we partner with you to do that?
Right.
And we're happy to do that because it's a space in which we live, and and we can help people understand what messages will resonate, which messages are authentic. And I just want to make this clear. It's not gut. It's not just because we're Black, we know this. We
Right.
do a ridiculous amount of research at BET. We have an extraordinary consumer insights team. And yes, we have gut, but we take our guts to the field. And what I mean by that is, so for example, we've been polling our community around its perception of the current crisis, its perception of police brutality. We polled our community immediately when COVID-19 started hitting to understand how COVID-19 was hitting our community. And what we immediately saw was once the stay-at-home orders were implemented, 54% of our community reported out that they were having a food crisis. And 50% of our community were reporting out that they had a financial crisis. So we understood, because we had pre-existing data, that it was going to disproportionately impact our community. Notwithstanding that, we still went and did research and had it affirmed and the levels established, and we actually mapped our plans based on those insights.
I imagine also one of the things that would have to change, or from a creative side, would just be the people creating the content. In order to have diverse content, you need diversity in the people creating it. Is that something that you're sort of providing guidance on, or those conversations that you're seeing happening?
That we haven't yet gotten there. We think that's a really critical issue. The media business is appallingly non-diverse, and it's not limited to the agencies. It's not limited to the brands. It's really the business. I find it personally ridiculously heartbreaking. We have as you can imagine, the majority of the population of BET is African American, but we actually have a diverse workforce. We have representation from virtually every ethnic group in the country. The organizing principle is not your ethnicity; it's your affinity for Black culture. The thing is, when you look across the media landscape, when you look at large media companies, it's just striking the paucity of diverse executives in our industry, and that flows through the agency space, and it really is heartbreaking because there's so much talent out there, and this is such an amazing industry. It's such a dynamic industry, and it's a creative industry. So we're constantly having conversations with our clients about how do they evolve that? How do they change that? The number of times we've gone to meetings and someone says, the agency came in and pitched and there wasn't a single diverse person, ethnically diverse person in the room. And we're hearing clients say that this just can't be the way things work. So we're really hoping that, again, going back to this idea, what this unrest that we're seeing is triggered by these murders, but it's reflective of this broader issue around inequality and disparity. And so companies have an opportunity to look inside themselves and understand what they're doing to contribute to that.
Has diversity and inclusion been harder to do amid COVID-19? It's as we're looking at hiring and, cultivating employees at a time where we're all working remotely. How has that made it harder to make that a priority?
Well, I think the inclusion side actually is more important in this COVID-19 world than it was before. And then overlay the current crisis on top of COVID, and it makes inclusion particularly critical. There was an article circulated by a bunch of diverse executives yesterday about how now is a uniquely challenging time for African American executives in corporate America, because the extraordinary stress, pressure, assault, equally the idea that you're often, because there's so few of you, expected to represent your entire community in this corporate entity, and so really using inclusive practices and creating opportunities to be respectful of who people are is so critically important. And that has nothing to do with ethnic diversity. Now, a very simple example of that is, an inclusion practice is to recognize that parents with children at home are managing a phenomena that they've not managed previously. And if we tell people, well, we're indifferent to that, you simply have to accommodate and work a regular 9-to-5 schedule, then that's not reflective of their reality. That's not an inclusive leadership approach. So I think companies have to be massively leaning into inclusivity at this point. Diversity is a little bit more challenging, in part because one, so few people are hiring, and two, given the financial crisis, a lot of people are freezing, not just hiring, but freezing promotions and what have you. So I think that part's a little bit more challenging, but this is an opportunity. In macro, crises are an opportunity to really demonstrate your values and demonstrate your leadership. And I think that for brands, that's critically important. And this really represents an extraordinary opportunity for brands.
And before we end, one or two, positive, realistic changes that you hope maybe could come from this time?
Well, I think one change that I really hope for is that corporate America will lean in much more aggressively to help drive solutions that local and state and federal governments just find completely intractable. There are a series of practices that corporations have adopted that if you apply them to things like policing and what have you, I fundamentally believe we would get different outcomes. So I really would love to see corporations be encouraged to be more active. I think about a year and a half ago, when the issue wasn't race, but when the issue was gender, we won't signal out the company, but a particular company created an ad execution that was very specific around kind of gender issues with men, and they received more negative comments for that ad on social media than they did than they received positives. And a whole bunch of the comments were, "Hey, stay out of this social stuff. Make the products you make." And basically, it was the corporate version of shut up and dribble. And I would like to see companies not shut up and dribble. I would like to see companies instead say, we do have a role to play, and we can be extraordinary partners, and we can help drive change. And actually, if we are change agents, it's going to further enhance our relationship with our consumers. So that to me is an important change. And then the second thing I think is I've not seen previously this broad a group of institutions, individuals, and corporations to be invested in this issue of social justice. And so my hope is this elevated level of focus and attention that this issue has helps drive actual change. Because what we know is these issues are massively intractable. If everybody recalls, there were police killings when Barack Obama was president. Who the president is doesn't solve for this issue. Right. And recognizing that complexity, recognizing that it's going to have to be a coalition of players, I am hoping that the way corporations are leaning into this, that they're going to play an active role in the solution.
Thanks, Scott, for joining us, and thanks everyone for watching. And as always, thank you to our Ad Age crew, Alfred Mascaroni, Anna Sakula, Max Sternlicht, and Elise Liffring for making this live stream happen. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.